Lawyers of Reddit. How do you argue without crying? It's less about crying from the running the case argument, and more about the stress and sadness of the subject matter, but for the most part, cases aren't two lawyers having a heated argument with each other. They are just factual legal submissions often aggressively delivered to try convince a judge or jury to favor their side. There's an old phrase, a man who is his own lawyer has a fool for a client. Your lawyer may care about you and your case, but he or she is never going to be as emotionally involved as you are. It may sound cold, but this distance from the topic allows the lawyer to provide clearer-headed advice than might occur to you, and to be able to argue your case in a way that is most effective, rather than what might happen if your own passion was flowing out. My husband is an attorney for family law and does a fair deal of cases involving child abuse. He doesn't cry during argument, before or after. He just never sleeps. Poor guy. My father was a lawyer, and family law or criminal involving children he just absolutely refused to do. When I was old enough to understand why, I gained a lot of respect for him as a human, which at the time was hard because he was hard to grow up under. Mom said once that it kept him up and ate him up. Your husband is doing good work, but the toll seems to be hard to handle. Good thoughts to you both. I've only cried once during a sentencing hearing when I was a prosecutor. It had to do with a mother selling her 11-year-old to a bunch of men. But the rest of it, you save it for before or after. Typically you get angry or anxious or worried during hearings, not teary. The only cases I've cried were two pro bono asylum cases I worked on. Pro bono is like volunteer work. One was tears of joy, the other very much tears of sorrow. And regarding the arguing bit, I don't work in an emotional area of law. Sure, I've worked hard to craft my arguments to their strongest point possible, but at the end of the day, whether I win or lose, my client is still likely going to be insanely rich. No one's rights have been trampled. It's tough to get super attached in my cases. Also, most of my arguing has already been done on paper multiple times, so I have an idea how all parties will be reacting ahead of time. Can you talk about the cases that made you cry? Not the OP, but my brother works on asylum cases. I'm also in the legal field, but not immigration. He'll sometimes tell me about his more difficult, interesting cases. He represented one client seeking asylum after going through some truly horrific things in his home country. At the trial, his client had to describe the events in detail on the stand. By the time he was done, opposing counsel and even the judge were holding back tears. My brother had already run through his testimony with him enough times that he knew what to expect and held it together, but he said it was still pretty difficult. Law school teaches you to only care about the facts and not so much the emotions surrounding it. Once your brain is trained for a legal formula, it's easier to argue without being affected by emotion. Plus eventually you become cynical and numb and most stuff doesn't bother you anymore. I was on a jury once in a murder case. The accused had the odds stacked against him, but in the end the prosecutor just couldn't push things over the beyond a reasonable doubt hurdle and we acquitted the accused man. The guy had a female public defender for a lawyer. When the verdict was read, she broke down and cried. She had worked hard for her client, but I don't believe even she thought she would get him off. All of us jurors felt that the guy actually probably did do it. The prosecutor's case just had too many holes. We all agreed that we felt like we needed to go home and take a shower. All of us jurors felt that the guy actually probably did do it. The prosecutor's case just had too many holes, and that's how it should be. All criminal defendants are presumed not guilty unless the state can prove beyond reasonable doubt otherwise. If the state cannot meet that burden of proof, the correct verdict is not guilty, regardless of your gut instinct, or even if you think he probably did. Kudos to your jury for sticking by that. In civil cases, contract disputes, personal injury, there isn't much to cry over. It's mostly paperwork. I do a fair bit of family litigation and there isn't really a good guy versus bad guy. It's always shades of grey. The system works best and the law develops properly when each side brings their best arguments on the evidence. People get emotional in family law, especially custody, but it's not your problem. You simply work with the facts your client has and advance the best argument you can. Arguing during litigation is different from just arguing. You're focused on remembering the law, listening to what's being said and argued on the other side, and formulating a response. Because it's your job to do so, there isn't much room to be emotional. I save the crying for my office, car, shower, pretty much anywhere but the courtroom. I'm in criminal defense and female. I'm not sure why I mentioned that, except that we, as a gender, are stereotypically more criers than men. It's all business in the courtroom though. I've definitely left the courtroom very upset, heated, and emotional. Generally we just come back to my mostly female office and scream about it. We let each other scream and vent, and then it's on to the next case. We just have too much work to do to get knocked down by one case. You have to take that energy and channel it into your work. I'm also not predisposed to crying much, maybe once every 2 years. Law school and then the practice of law hardens you. One of my co-workers would describe herself as a constant crier. She will peer her Peloton rides and cry about it. I've seen her cry in the courtroom a few times, but very discreetly and after the client and ASA have left. Legal arguments aren't personal. You're just doing your job and advocating for your client. The trick is really not to get personally involved, which may be easier for example in competition law or more difficult for example in criminal law depending on your area of expertise. This is why I decided to specialize in other areas than criminal law, which I set out to do, because I felt it would be too hard on me emotionally. Then again, this also depends on the type of cases you get and the type of person you are. I self-repped in family court during a very bitter divorce custody battle. My ex was doing everything she could to ruin my relationship with my kids. One thing we had was baseball. I coached their little league games. My daughter, 9 at the time, is smaller than most kids her age. Terrible at bat. Nervous about everything. I worked with her a lot and built up her confidence. Finally one game she connected with the ball and made it to first base. Next batter, she got to second. Next batter, she got to third. Next batter, she crossed home. My shy, quiet daughter was a completely different person as she celebrated her first baseball run. And her mother chose to keep her away from all her baseball games when the kids were with her just to spite me. Telling the story of my daughter's first baseball run in court, it was impossible to hold back my tears. Even the court clerk was in tears. I eventually got a court order that her mom had to get her to all her little league games. Some interesting answers here, but I can't help but feel like OP was looking more for on how lawyers control certain reactive emotions in the heat of debate, not necessarily emotional responses to sad cases. For example, in the instances where I've felt mistreated or been yelled at while at work, it triggers something that makes just responding with a coherent reply feel like wading through waist deep water with a tiger in pursuit behind me. It takes extra effort to keep it together and move forward when I start feeling like prey. That kind of strain could certainly make someone want to cry in response. And maybe that is how OP often feels in arguments, and thus can't imagine how professionals who she perceives end up in these situations for a living can do it. The only thing I would question is, are such heated arguments actually common as a trial lawyer? Lawyers argue a case in court but not, I think, in the form of shouting matches with either witnesses or other lawyers. So maybe there's some misconception here that may explain why actual lawyers' responses here may seem to be answering a different question. I've been a public defender for about 20 years. There are times I need to stop my arguments and compose myself. There are also times I cry on my way back to my office or after work. I guess my answer is that I don't argue without crying so much as I put off crying until I'm done. Some cases are tougher than others. Practice. When you start doing audiences is hard, but with time you became used to it. It's funny. To me the feeling is almost like to separate myself of what I'm doing. It's a form of blinding myself, but at home. Later, depending of the thing is hard. I have some cases that are still hunting me years after what happened, especially in what concerns family law. A lot of comments seem to gloss over what I perceive as an important part of the OP's question: how do lawyers cope with constant confrontation? Adversarial relationships. Questioning of one's character and honesty. Being told you're being unreasonable, etc. Some areas of law have less of this. If you're a transactional lawyer, you have disagreements with the other parties. But everyone's trying to get to the same place and make a deal happen. Many criminal cases may not be particularly adversarial either. Most end with a plea bargain that is just a negotiation over the charges and the strength of the evidence, without any real dispute to the underlying facts. For example, you're caught on camera stealing, or a canine found drugs in your car. Working with regulatory agencies can be similar. You might just be working with a bureaucrat to make sure the forms get filled out right. Family law is among the worst. It's insanely emotional and every aspect of every case is a bitter fight to the death. Want an extension of 48 hours to file your brief? Go to heck. Immigration asylum cases are similar. Everything is wrapped in human tragedy. Many criminal cases are extremely hard on the lawyers, as folks have detailed in this thread. But even run-of-the-mill cases with an unemotional subject matter can take a heavy toll on the lawyer. Even if you do something boring or that's just paperwork like patent law or contract disputes, your relationship with opposing counsel can make it grueling. I've had lawyers accuse me of lying, withholding documents, treat me suspiciously, yell at me, call me unprofessional, question my intelligence, question my ethics, to my face, over the phone, via email, in court, on the record, in depositions, you name it. I've been compared to Hitler. How do lawyers cope? In my experience, a lot of them drink. As many as 1 in 5 lawyers is a problem drinker, twice the national rate. Link. SWWW. American Bar. Org Group's Lawyer Assistance Resources. Alcohol abuse dependence. I've seen a lot of folks take out the stress on their families, but the divorce rate among lawyers as a whole is lower than you'd expect. Drug abuse is much more common than you'd think for folks who have an ethical and professional obligation to be law-abiding citizens. In my personal life, I'm not a confrontational person, and I pride myself on making people feel welcome. Being able to talk to anyone at a party comfortably, making polite small talk with strangers, and generally being a nice, laid-back, agreeable dude. At work I have to put on a different persona of someone who is thick-skinned, callous, professional, robotic. If I have a confrontational call, I'll need to take time to calm down and center myself. If I have a rough deposition or day in court, I have to exercise or meditate to purge it, or it will ruin my evening. Sometimes I can't open important emails after business hours, because if I do it will ruin my family time and my evening, or my night of sleep. I've dealt with panic attacks my whole life, never in court, always after. There's no off button or truly off the clock in my job. It is a constant daily struggle to keep the stress and emotions in check. And for me, it's impossible to be perfect at stopping myself from taking things personally. Keep in mind, even if we get contentious in that courtroom, we walk right out and shake hands with opposing counsel and discuss plans to get our families together. It's not an emotional form of argument usually, it's a job, and we usually use reasoning. If it looks like emotional argument, usually the emotional part is a performance, like being in a play, to get the result we want. You cannot equate it with arguments you have in your daily life. For me, the reason I don't cry while arguing is simple: the process isn't meant to be adversarial. I hate arguments where it's personal and confrontational. And that is usually what makes people cry. You go, make your case, present your research on legal precedent and how it ties into the facts of your case, and hope the judge understands what you meant to say and agrees. Also, the nerves anxiety of putting your point across well and not sounding stupid or unprepared has been a really intense factor for me, and the feeling of being on the spot takes over and doesn't leave room for any other emotions. Family lawyer here. Personally, I often express frustration with tears in disagreements in my day-to-day life. Professionally, this frustration manifests normally, since it usually stems from annoyances and ridiculous tactics used by other lawyers. I often find it amusing when an opposing counsel uses personal attacks and ridiculous tactics, because I'm just dumbfounded by the approach. It is incredibly rare to get into a back and forth heated argument with an opposing counsel or party. When it does happen, It's usually in the hallway during a break, or before submissions are made. My usual response is to distance myself, as these kinds of discussions are not productive, and are actually a disservice to the client if we engage. I can say that I have been given some very poor decisions by judges in different applications. These have usually been related to protection orders, domestic violence, or when a judge refuses to actually read the materials provided, having already made their mind up about the decision. I have had to fight back an emotional response numerous times in front of a judge, after learning the hard way at the very beginning of my career that disputing a decision made by a judge in front of said judge will cause them to get quite upset with you and potentially tarnish their view of you for future cases of yours. We never know when we will be in front of the same judge again. So mastering your emotions in that room is paramount to your future success and frankly your reputation. If you are presenting in an open court in front of other lawyers, the public, your client, and possibly their family, this is a learned response that becomes second nature with time. Outward expressions of frustration, sadness, defeat. These are generally shown to our friends, spouses, and coworkers at our firms only. People pay us to stay solid. Don't get me wrong. I've cried with a client less than a handful of times, based on the heartbreaking nature of the situation, abduction, abuse, etc. Time and a place though. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.